The evening carried a beauty that words struggled to capture. The cool autumn air smelled faintly of wood smoke, and the trees painted the streets with shades of orange and gold. Margaret, now 52, loved this season in Vermont. It always made her feel calm, even if her own life didn't match that peace. She had silver strands in her hair, lines on her face that carried the weight of both joy and hardship, and a heart that had long since learned to hide its emotions. She had been a wife once, she was always a mother, but somewhere along the way she stopped expecting life to surprise her. Her daughter Emily, 27, had married James 2 years earlier. From the first time Margaret met him, she understood his charm. James had a way of making people feel seen, his smile warm, his presence easy. That evening, Margaret hosted them for dinner. The house was filled with the comforting smell of roast, mashed potatoes, and apple pie. Candles glowed softly, the fireplace crackled, and laughter carried through the rooms as they ate and shared stories. James was polite, engaging, and full of compliments for Emily. But every now and then, Margaret caught him looking at her. His glances were quick, almost unnoticeable, but they lingered in ways that unsettled her. It felt like a quiet hum beneath the surface, something she wasn't supposed to hear but couldn't ignore. When Emily's phone rang, she stepped out to take the call. Margaret gathered the plates, and James followed her into the kitchen. The warm light made the silence heavier. Standing at the sink, she sensed him close behind her. When she turned, their eyes met, and for a moment her heartbeat stumbled. "Margaret," he said softly, almost like a secret. "You look beautiful tonight." The words froze her. They weren't the harmless compliments he gave Emily, this felt different, personal. The scent of his cologne and the weight of his gaze only deepened her confusion. She forced herself to respond with a quiet, "Thank you," but the air between them shifted, thick with something unspoken. Her chest fluttered, and she hated herself for the way it made her feel. It had been years since anyone looked at her as though she was more than just a mother, more than a woman living in the shadow of the past. Before anything else could unfold, Emily's footsteps echoed on the stairs. James stepped back with ease, slipping into his usual smile just as Emily re-entered the room. Margaret turned back to the dishes, her hands moving while her thoughts stayed fixed on what had just happened. She told herself she was imagining it, that maybe she had misread the moment. But deep down, she already knew it wasn't just in her head. The autumn evening was beautiful, with cool air carrying the faint scent of smoke and the streets lined with gold and orange leaves. Vermont in the fall had always been Margaret's favorite season. At 52, she had silver woven through her chestnut hair and gentle lines on her face that told the story of both laughter and struggle. Once a wife, always a mother, but now a woman who no longer expected surprises from life. Her daughter Emily, 27, had married James 2 years earlier. From the start, Margaret understood why her daughter loved him. James had a natural charm, a warmth that made people feel truly seen. He could turn strangers into friends with his smile, and when he spoke, you wanted to believe him. That night, Margaret prepared a comforting meal for them, roast, mashed potatoes, and apple pie. Candles flickered on the table, cinnamon filled the air, and the fireplace added its soft crackle. The evening was full of laughter and talk about Emily's work, memories, and bits of small-town gossip. James was attentive and kind to Emily, but every so often, Margaret caught his eyes on her a little too long. It wasn't obvious, but it was enough to make her feel something stir inside, something she tried to dismiss. When Emily stepped away to answer a work call, Margaret began clearing the plates. James followed her into the kitchen, and in the warmth of that light, the silence felt heavier than before. Standing close, he looked at her with an intensity that unsettled her. Then, in a low voice, he said, "You look beautiful tonight." The words froze her. They weren't like the casual compliments he gave her daughter. These felt personal. For a moment, she could smell his cologne, feel the weight of his gaze, and sense the unspoken meaning beneath his tone. She whispered a careful, "Thank you," but her chest fluttered with feelings she wished she didn't have. It had been years since anyone looked at her as though she was more than a mother, more than her past. Before anything else could be said, Emily's footsteps returned. James stepped back smoothly, wearing his easy smile again as if nothing had happened. Margaret went back to the dishes, but her mind replayed the moment again and again. She told herself it was harmless, that she had misread it. But deep down, she knew she hadn't. When they left later, James gave her one last glance before getting into the car. It was just a look, but not just a look. That night, when Margaret turned off the lights and went to bed, his voice and his eyes followed her into the dark. In the days that followed, she tried to dismiss it. She reminded herself he was her son-in-law, and there was no reason to think he had meant more than kindness. But the memory lingered, a song she couldn't stop humming in her head. And though she hated herself for it, part of her longed to feel that spark again. 3 days later, Emily called to say she'd be out of town for work, gone for nearly a week. Margaret wished her well and thought nothing more of it, until James appeared at her door one afternoon, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing that same disarming smile. "Thought you might like some company," he said. Margaret hesitated, then let him in. They sat on the porch while a light drizzle fell, the air filled with the smell of wet leaves. At first, their talk was simple, about the weather, new places in town, books. But then his questions turned more personal. "What were you like before you were a mom?" he asked, watching her carefully. She laughed softly, almost embarrassed, but he urged her to tell him. And so she did. She spoke of her 20s, the job she loved, her dreams of traveling, and the love she once had but lost. She admitted how life had closed doors without asking if she was ready. James listened closely, not as though she was just someone's mother, but as a woman with her own story. At one point, his hand brushed against hers. It was light, almost accidental, but she didn't pull away. Her breath caught. Then, softly, he asked, "Do you ever think about what could have been?" The question tightened her chest. She wasn't sure if he meant her past, or if he was hinting at something far more dangerous. She looked at him, trying to find the right response, but all she could manage was a faint, "sometimes." A silence followed, the kind that felt thick with words neither of them dared to speak. Outside, the rain filled the quiet, a steady rhythm that only made her more aware of how close they were sitting. If she leaned forward just slightly, she could have reached him. But she didn't move. After a while, James glanced at his watch and stood. "I should let you rest," he said, though his tone hinted at something more. Margaret walked him to the door, her pulse still unsettled. Before leaving, he turned back and caught her eyes with a look that made her feel both seen and unsteady. "Thanks for the coffee," she whispered, softer than she intended. "Anytime," he replied with a faint smile before stepping into the rain. When the door closed, Margaret sank back onto the porch, staring out into the mist. She told herself it was nothing, just kindness, but the truth was undeniable, she hadn't felt this alive, or this afraid, in years. That night, she lay awake, her thoughts restless and tangled. She reminded herself that this was wrong. James was her daughter's husband, a man who belonged to Emily. Yet her heart wouldn't let go of the way he had looked at her, the brush of his hand against hers, and that lingering question, what could have been? It no longer felt like a question about her past. It felt like it was about the two of them. For years, Margaret had lived a life of duty. She had raised her daughter, given her love, and buried her own longings beneath responsibility and kindness. But James had stirred something she thought was gone, a sense of being alive, wanted, and seen. The next day, he came again. Margaret hadn't expected it, but there he was at her door, smiling warmly, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers picked from the nearby fields. "I thought you might like these," he said softly. She took them, their scent light and fresh, and invited him inside. The afternoon sun streamed gently through the curtains as they sat in the living room. Their conversation touched on ordinary things, yet beneath their words lay a pull neither could ignore. James looked at her with a tenderness that felt like a promise. Slowly, almost without thought, he reached for her hand. His touch was steady but careful. Margaret didn't pull away. Instead, she felt warmth spread through her chest, a dangerous mix of comfort and fear. For a moment, the world outside seemed to fall away. It was just the two of them, joined by a feeling neither dared to name. James leaned in slightly, his voice low, almost a confession. "I can't stop thinking about you." Margaret's breath caught. She wanted to believe it was just a slip, a weakness that would pass if they ignored it. But deep down, she knew she had been thinking of him too. She wanted to pull back, to remind both of them of the lines they should never cross, but her heart refused to listen. Tears welled in her eyes, though she tried to hide them. "James, we can't," she whispered, her voice trembling. He nodded slowly, his gaze heavy with regret and something more. "I know," he said softly. "But it doesn't change how I feel." Margaret looked down at their joined hands, torn between the safety of what was right and the dangerous pull of what felt real. That night, sleep escaped her. Her mind kept replaying the way he had held her hand, the gentleness in his eyes, and the traitorous stirrings of her own heart. She thought of Emily, her daughter, her joy, her reason to be careful. How could she protect her if she allowed this to grow? How could she forgive herself if she didn't? The days that followed became a silent battle. She and James kept their distance, but the connection remained, thrumming like an invisible thread neither could cut. One evening, as they stood at the doorway saying goodbye after a visit, James stopped her. His voice was low, urgent. "Margaret, I don't want to hurt Emily, but I can't pretend this isn't happening." She looked into his eyes, seeing both hope and sorrow reflected back at her. "Neither can I," she admitted quietly. They stood there, suspended on the edge of something that could change everything, knowing that the next step might destroy the family, or break their own hearts. The weight of choice pressed down on Margaret, heavier than anything she had carried in years. Margaret knew that whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same. After her last visit with James, the world around her felt unsettled, as though something had shifted beyond her control. Even her home seemed different, quieter, heavier, as if it were holding its breath and waiting for something to break. She moved through the next day slowly, keeping to her routine. Though inside her thoughts spun endlessly. Every moment with James had left an imprint on her heart, tender, painful, and impossible to ignore. Her mind kept drifting back to Emily, her daughter's bright smile and unwavering trust. Emily deserved a mother who would never betray her. That evening, Margaret made a choice she knew would change everything. Instead of calling James or finding another excuse to see him, she drove to a small lake just outside town. It was a place she had loved since childhood, where the water reflected the fading light and the trees seemed to whisper their secrets. Sitting in her car, she watched the sun melt into soft shades of pink and gold. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone and typed a message. "James, we can't see each other like this anymore. Whatever feelings we have, we need to stop, for Emily, and for ourselves. I hope you understand." She pressed send before she could lose the courage. The silence that followed wrapped around her like a blanket. The decision hurt, but she knew it was the only way to protect her daughter, and herself, from heartbreak that could never be undone. The next morning, Emily came home from her trip, tired but glowing with stories of the people she had met and the work she had done. Margaret embraced her warmly, listening and smiling, though inside a quiet ache pressed against her chest. She kept her secret hidden behind steady eyes and calm words. James, too, seemed changed. At dinner that night, he avoided looking directly at her, his gaze fixed on his plate or drifting to the window. But once, when he thought no one was watching, their eyes met. For the briefest moment, there was a flicker of something, longing, regret, and the unspoken promise that what had happened between them would remain theirs alone. Margaret forced a faint smile, though her heart ached with the weight of what she had lost. She had chosen loyalty over desire, her daughter's happiness over her own longing. Yet as the night stretched on, one question echoed inside her, refusing to fade. Had she saved her world, or had she simply silenced her heart? What if? The question lingered in Margaret's mind like a shadow that refused to leave. What if she had let herself feel more? What if she had crossed the line she had drawn so carefully? The thoughts were soft but persistent, reminding her of the warmth of James's touch, the kindness in his voice, and the moment her heart had betrayed her own rules. Life, however, moved forward as it always does. Emily returned to her routines, full of love and trust for her husband, never suspecting how close the fragile thread of their family had come to breaking. Margaret buried her feelings deep, holding on instead to the memory of the night sky over the lake and the promise she had made to herself. Still, some nights when the house was quiet, she would find herself staring out the window, lost in the ache of wondering what might have been. The temptation had nearly consumed her, yet she knew in her heart that certain boundaries had to be honored, even when every part of her longed to cross them. And so, Margaret carried on. Stronger, wiser, but forever haunted by the choice she made, she walked through her days with the silent knowledge that love, desire, and sacrifice rarely live far apart. Thank you so much for staying with us through this story. Every tale we share is meant to remind us of the hidden emotions, choices, and struggles that shape our lives in unexpected ways. If you enjoyed this story and would love to hear more, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and stay connected with us. Your support means everything, and it inspires us to keep bringing you more real, heartfelt, and unforgettable stories. Stay tuned, there's so much more to come.